You know, I'm really proud of Vikings as a show. They had this amazing character that they introduced who was sweet and likable and kind. They had some really amazing moments. And you know what they didn't do? They didn't exploit that for a cheap, one-off, emotional punch to the gut, because Vikings is above that. They wouldn't be the literal worst scum in the world. Welcome back everyone to my episode 5 season 6 Vikings review. Let's go through some of the different characters and things I enjoyed in this episode so we can fill up that void that was left by Halli's death. So let's begin with Bjorn's storyline. After his resounding defeat in the previous episode, getting caught in that trap by Olaf, his men are pinned in their camp by Olaf's forces. Now Bjorn, assuming that Olaf would behave like a very normal feudal lord, assumes that Olaf will take his overwhelming advantage and wipe them out. However, Bjorn's unaware that Olaf is closer to the mental state of Hvitserk than he is to himself. So yet again, we have a very strange and wacko conversation between the Buddha / Olaf and a very confused Bjorn. Now at this point, Harald's pretty tired and used to his yada yada, but Bjorn is still taking a little bit aback. In these few scenes we get, we see that Bjorn's mind is still quite focused on helping out Harald. He makes sure one of his only demands to meet with Olaf is that Harald is alive and well and part of the discussion. He holds on to his drink of mead throughout the entire conversation just so he can hand it off to Harald because he sees he's quite thirsty. And we can kind of get hints of the subtext of the different scenes that there is some time that Harald and Bjorn gets to talk in between making huge decisions and they're kind of working together. When Olaf gives his huge proposal of electing a king of all of Norway, uniting the entire kingdom to stop all the infighting, we can see that Harald is quite concerned about what Bjorn is thinking and saying. We can see him look kind of down as he knows he's not in a position to be like, actually that's what I want all along. Especially as Olaf is really focusing and hammering the point that Bjorn should be this leader and that he'll even give up all of his kingdoms to Bjorn if he takes the role. Throughout all of these scenes, there's so much left unsaid, and I think we'll get that kind of exposed in the next episode, but it really gives us a lot of intrigue to how this is going to play out. Even in the very last scene when Bjorn comes back with Harald and they tell Olaf that they'll agree to his plan, we can see the wording and the way they talk and look at each other is very off. Bjorn says, "We agree to your plan," making it very clear that he considers him and Harald a team. Then Harald speaks up second, saying that Olaf should send out word to all the earls and kings, and it is Flatnose, not Bjorn or Harald, that says to elect Bjorn Ironside. And when Flatnose does say that, both Bjorn and Harald look down, they kind of look to each other, like there's something unsaid there that's a bit off. And then when Olaf kind of goes off on his crazy rant, he's like, "I already have," and starts yelling, we see both Harald and Bjorn a little bit concerned. And the important thing to note is that before we actually get to this point, we have that whole confrontation between Flatnose and Bjorn, where Bjorn demands the answers about Iceland, blames him for Floki's death until he shows up, and especially we get that very ominous shot of him looking through the tent at Ironside, saying that each must die someday. So if Bjorn and Harald did have a plan and a discussion about how they're going to approach the election, it might not be as straightforward as just electing Bjorn, then it could be quite unlikely that Flatnose was actually part of that discussion. One of the biggest discussions we've been having in the comments of my preview breakdown is about this election and where we see Bjorn and Harald landing. Historically, we know that Harald becomes king of all Norway, and Bjorn becomes the king of Sweden. So the idea of them kind of splitting up the different land into Norway and Sweden, where Olaf's previous lands that he offered to Bjorn are kind of Sweden, and all of the other people's kingdoms together are Norway, allowing Harald to complete his dream of becoming king of all Norway and uniting the country. So that could be an interesting way they move forward with this story. However, it does seem a little bit too simple and anticlimactic just for Bjorn to hand Harald the kingdom. So we move back to Kattegat and we see that Ubbe is actually serious about sending Hvitserk on this mission along the Silk Road. He hopes and believes that by giving Hvitserk this responsibility, he'll clean himself up, get his act together, and lead this mission and improve his life. However, we know that Hvitserk is dealing with substance abuse, probably taking some drugs. He's made himself very frail and physically ill by closing himself in with other sick people and away from light, and is still suffering heavily from these delusions. And the idea that he can just kind of throw that all off and move forward to this new destiny is just preposterous. This whole episode with Hvitserk is really sad to kind of watch how deep he goes down this rabbit hole. He's disappointing the friends and family around him, everyone's sad they have to lock him up from hurting himself, he's vomiting everywhere, and the very last shot we get in this episode of him is just him freaking out in the mud, covered in dirt, all alone, which just sums up where he is right now. It was incredibly sad to watch that confrontation scene with Ubbe, we see that he doesn't really understand what he can do to help Hvitserk. He's seen his brother be strong and fierce and fight by his side, and so to have this kind of form, this pathetic leftover of him, breaks Ubbe's heart. And like so many family members and friends that don't really know how to deal with something like this, they just distance themselves. And the worst part is, I don't think that this is the worst we'll see Hvitserk at. So over in the Roos storyline, we can see that Ivar and Igor continue to bond, and he's even taught him a pretty fluent form of his own language. Ivar recognizes that Igor is the key to the kingdom. He holds all of the legitimacy and the power that Oleg uses to rule, and if he can communicate with him secretly without other guardsmen and stuff overhearing what they're saying, he can slowly move him in the right direction to see Oleg as more of a predator taking what is rightfully his, and that Ivar is just generously here to back him, to give him the support, to teach him what's right. At this point in the story, we see that Ivar finally feels comfortable and safe enough to start taking some risks. Because of the really dangerous position he's in with almost no power and a foreign land, he's had to move super slowly and carefully. He knew that if he made one wrong statement or decision, his fate would have been very similar to his loyal follower. Not exactly ideal. Now I was a little bit worried for a tiny bit when Igor came into the room with Ivar and he tries to get him to reiterate and say again what he was saying to him previously, and then he tells him that Oleg wants to see him. I'm like, wow, has this kid ratted him out already? I didn't think they were on those bad terms. But luckily for Ivar, it doesn't seem that Igor's betrayed him just yet. So finally Oleg has made all the preparations and he's ready to invade Scandinavia. Or as he says it, Scandinavia. Ivar had been assuming for quite some time what Oleg was looking for him to do. He wanted to have him as a son of Ragnar so he could have legitimacy to invade Kattegat and have him as a puppet ruler kind of working for Oleg. When Ivar kind of pushes him back a tiny bit, very softly on this, we see Oleg snap and his true vicious side kind of pointed towards Ivar for the first time. Ivar and Oleg have always had this kind of friendly yet combative relationship. In Ivar's mind, Oleg is definitely an enemy, someone that he needs to be worried about, a threat he needs to remove. But in a way, he still likes and respects him because of how crazy and similar they are. So yet again, we get to understand the full gravity of the situation and how big these stakes are for Ivar. All this makes it so that what happens in the next scene with Ivar and Prince Stur is so much more important. When you're making political moves of which people to back, it's quite a bold move to choose the brother who is tied up outside in a cage over the powerful lord who controls an army and wants to make you a king, even if it's just a puppet king. So I'm really excited for this storyline and what Ivar does, how he's going to take down Oleg, and what that will mean for the relationship he has with his brothers as they kind of clash again. So at long last, we finally get the battle scene that's been teased between Lagertha and her shield maidens and the outcasts that were thrown out by Bjorn. Right from the get-go, you had an understanding of how much of a disadvantage the villagers should have had against these bandits. Like having to rely on kids for your scouting and reporting system, and all of the archery, is definitely a strong sign of how little forces you actually have. But it was a pretty nice setup. They had a very good bottleneck with a good archery surprise ambush, and they gave the warriors, when they finally came out to meet them on the ground, a lot of advantage. It wasn't the most exciting or grand fight we've had in Viking, especially compared to some of the amazing stuff they pulled off, but it wasn't horrible considering half the people were old ladies. Definitely the highlight for this storyline was the very end where they had the emotional speech and the village kind of rallies together around the fallen comrades and says they'll defend it yet again. Now they all know that next time the bandits are going to be prepared and understand what they're fighting against, and their numbers are weaker, they won't have the element of surprise, and their fortifications are probably already wrecked. If the odds were horrible last time, they're even worse now. But the moment that young girl had that line, which is like, I don't want to leave my brother, you knew that they were all going to stay. So all in all, it was a pretty decent episode. We got a bunch of intrigue in the Bjorn storyline, a pretty cool battle with the bandits and Lagertha, Ivar finally starting to make some moves in the Roos, and Vix's storyline is just as depressing as ever. If you'd like to join a discussion about what could be happening next episode, I got my preview breakdown up already, you can watch that here. As well, if you're not subscribed to the channel, it'd be amazing for you to join the community here as well. Thanks for watching, and Skål!